So that's for everyone who can't be with us live. So this is the first Critical Internationalization Studies meeting of 2021. I'm Sharon Stein. I am the convener of the network. I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation, which is in what is currently known as Vancouver, Canada. I wanted to take some time at the beginning of the session just to thank the editors of our new network newsletter. Am I making, it sounds weird, right? Is there like a weird feedback? Okay, I think it stopped. Tell me if it starts again. Dr. Santiago Castillo Gutierrez, Dr. Tiffany Vigiano, and Dr. Melissa Watley for all of their hard work in putting that newsletter together. And they were going to be offering it on a monthly basis. If you're on our mailing list, you should have received it. If not, it's available on the CIS website. And we'll, do you want to say anything, Melissa or Tiffany, about the newsletter? You don't have to, but.
We have both on the website and in the newsletter you received, there are descriptions for the kinds of content that we're looking for, and we would be very excited to receive some submissions. So.
Very good. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any announcements they would like to share with the group while we're all here? Okay, fair enough. So without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome our speaker for today, Siseko Kumalo, who is the editor of the forthcoming volume entitled Decolonisation as Democratization, Global Insights into the South African Experience, and co-editor of Decolonizing Curricula and Pedagogy in Higher Education, Bringing Decolonial Theory into Contact with Teaching Practice. He also recently co-guest edited a special issue of Third World Thematics about decolonizing curricula and pedagogy in higher education. And he is also a Mandela Rhodes Scholar. So Siseko will speak, and then we will have a chance for Q&A. If you'd like, you can put the questions in the chat as we go if you're afraid of forgetting. I will also note that I have a sort of semi-urgent medical appointment that I could only make for an hour and a half from now. So I will need to leave an hour from now. So Melissa has kindly offered to take over the hosting duties when I need to go. And thank you, Melissa. So I will make you, Siseko, and Melissa co-hosts.
Colleagues, as Sharon does that, I'm going to ask us to please switch off our videos, just for the fact that in the Global South, we don't have as great network infrastructure as most folks up there in the North. Yeah. Cool stuff. So in order for there not to just be like a blank void kind of thing, I will take this opportunity to switch on mine, as well as just so that it can be aesthetically on par for the via recording. So colleagues, today and of course, I'm also going to put a bit of a disclaimer, which is to say that there are aspects that I would want to sort of look at that I didn't unfortunately have the time to be able to incorporate into my talk for this evening. And one of those is to say that there's, for those of us who are familiar, specifically with William Wellington Gqoba's epic poem, the one that I'll be discussing today, in contrast rather with the work of Stephen Bantu Biko. For those of us who are familiar with the text, there is an interesting debate that is currently happening, specifically among the sociolinguists and us philosophers. And the question really is the kind of, what do they call it? The kind of censorship that took place specifically in the republication of the text in 1906 by u-Siseko as well as u-Goba, rather because the Siseko text comes out in 2001. And the sort of censorship or the redaction it really points to, I suppose, the salient colonial discussions that were happening here in the South African context, specifically with respect to how Black intellectuals were resisting colonial incursion, and how that colonial incursion was then subsequently couched in very, very interesting ways. So I'm just going to give a very brief analysis, not a brief analysis, but rather just a brief overview of the two individuals that I'm going to be talking about. William Wellington Gqoba mostly was writing in the 19th century, born in 1840, and really begins to write in his 20s, very, very short life, because he's born in 1844, dies 1840 rather, dies in 1888, and in that particular time he was prominent among African intellectuals emerging in the Eastern Cape region of South Africa towards the end of the 19th century. By trade, he was a wagon maker, licensed preacher of the Free Church of Scotland, teacher, historian, poet, folklorist, and editor. For much of his brief life, he served on mission stations as a catechist and ended his career as editor of the Lovedale newspaper isiXhosa, which, of course, as I say, he was editing in those later years. And this particular epic poem that I will be focusing on in terms of my work comes from a series of publications. It came out necessarily as a series of publications in isiXhosa in that last year of his life in 1888. To which he contrived to contribute subversive poetry. This is now isiXhosa, outspokenly critical of Western education, the European administration of Black people, and of course the discrimination suffered by colonized Blacks in the South African context. u-Goba fashioned the figure of the Xhosa man of letters, unrivaled in his time. In the generic range of his writing, he was the author of letters, anecdotes, expositions of proverbs, histories, and poetry, including 2 poems in the form of debates that stood for over 50 years as the longest poems in Xhosa language, and of course, this is one of those poems is the one that I will be talking to today, which is Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo. And of course, u-Goba is then sort of succeeded, as it were, by Stephen Bantu Biko, Biko, who writes in the 20th century in South Africa, also in many respects sort of resisting the colonial administration. And of course, now this was neo-colonialism, and a neo-colonialism of a very interesting kind in South Africa, because this was under the nationalist government of apartheid, which was in many instances far more violent, I would suggest, both in terms of its modes of governance, as well as in its approach. It was far more violent than what we had seen previously in terms of colonial governments, both in the Cape, and here, of course, the Cape was inclusive of territories such as KwaZulu-Natal, moving down into the Eastern Cape, Western Cape, as well as the interior governments which were more Afrikaner-based, of course. What we saw from 1948 onwards was something a hell of a lot more violent and a hell of a lot more active in terms of its sustained production of legislation that was targeted at the oppression, systematic oppression of Black people in the country. Now, Biko, for me, and this is, you know, at this point in time, I'm still, I'm still sort of working on a hypothesis in many respects. Although if one really takes a look at Biko's work, Because I Write What I Like, and contrasts Because I Write What I Like with William Wellington Gqoba's Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo, one begins to see a series of similarities between the two texts. And what I am pressing here, colleagues, really or fundamentally is the question of intellectual integrity. Now, how am I pressing this question of intellectual integrity? I'm pressing it both on the side of the South African Academy, which then of course prizes Steve Biko as the leading intellectual of Black liberation in South Africa. And this of course happens as a result of Biko's writing in English, whereas u-Goba was writing in isiXhosa. So I'm prizing the question of intellectual integrity in terms of the kind of work that we have done in terms of surfacing the ancestries, as it were, of our intellectual traditions, both in the South African context, as well as how that can contribute broadly. And of course, I'm also questioning Biko's intellectual integrity. Now, of course, this can sound very, very contentious, especially for the Bikoists, both here at home as well as abroad. They would say to me, how dare I do that kind of work? And as I say again, if I go chapter by chapter, looking at Because I Write What I Like, which of course was a compilation of a series of texts that he then produced in the, what was it? It was in the 70s. You begin to really see a very interesting kind of approach in terms of his work and the similarities with u-Goba. But before I go into before I go into my analysis, I just wish to quote the ways in which u-Goba introduces this epic poem through sort of a foreword, as it were, in isiXhosa itself. And of course, he's speaking here through a particular character. And this particular poem, by the way, is curated between the epic poem itself, is curated between 36 participants. And this is why it is one of the longest poems that has ever been written in isiXhosa, written, of course, as I say, in the 19th century in 1888. So he curates this debate between 36 participants, with u-Dlaba, one of the characters, being taken to be the leader or the chair of this particular discussion. And of course, I must also admit, for those of us who are not familiar with the naming processes in the Bantu peoples and in the cultures of the Bantu peoples, the name that is given both to a person or to a character in the context of u-Goba's discussion already gives us an indication of the kind of contribution that that particular individual will make into the discussion, right? And u-Goba is very systematic and very, very clear and very deliberate about the kinds of names that he gives. So u-Dlaba then, so u-Dlaba, how can I translate that name? Because I'm also very cautious, by the way, colleagues, of the translation of names, because in many instances, English undermines our names in very, very interesting ways. u-Dlaba can be suggested as somebody who I suppose, whose contribution or whose analysis in this particular discussion is not always going to be agreeable with the kind of approach that the other participants will take. And this is revealed to us, I would suggest, in the start of the epic poem, as I say, when u-Dlaba himself gives us, in some respects, an overview of how he would wish the conversation to go. And he advises the participants in the following ways. He says here, uvakele ekhalima ngobushushu obukhulu esithi nokuba kwizindlu ezifundisa amashishini nokuba kusezikuleni zomthinjana tunto yona siyenzelwa ngoku ngaba bantu. Mna okwami ndibona nje sendincamile, ingaba nini kambe madodana nani mthinjana wakowethu eningaba nisakholwa koko ningabaqondi aba bantu kuba nisengabantwana, right? So to give the translation, and this is not my translation here, this is the translation given by Jeff Opland, this in that collection that they did between himself, Wandile Kuse, as well as Pamela Maseko. The meeting was started in due form. The chairman, ungrateful, that is what they give, that is how they translate his name, u-Dlaba, as ungrateful, stated that the purpose of the meeting, or stated rather the purpose of the meeting, well, with great eloquence, he outlined the importance of education, how people were educated in the past, and how they were educated at present. He commented on how people should be taught in order to counter jealousy, envy, spite with deep emotion. He said, whether in trade or schools or schools for youngsters, these people are doing nothing for us. I've lost all hope. I don't know. You might still be satisfied because you're young and don't know these people. I am delighted you've asked me to chair this meeting so that I can learn your views on how these people teach us. They abuse us, they discriminate, and are not particularly interested in our welfare. For the time being, let me end here, and I'll expand when you've aired your views on the matter. The topic is now open for discussion. So this is how u-Dlaba opens the discussion that u-Gqoba curates in this particular debate of Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo, the great debate about education. And even in the wording, colleagues, and I might be sort of putting out conjecture here, but forgive me for that if that is how I am read. Even in the wording of this particular text, if one really pays attention specifically to the translation, forget the isiXhosa version, because I think for a lot of people that is closed off. But in the translation of the text, I'll read it again, right? Just to highlight this. He says, "I've lost all hope. I don't know. You might still be satisfied because you're young and don't know these people. I'm delighted you've asked me to chair this meeting so that I can learn your views on how these people teach us. They abuse us, they discriminate, and are not particularly interested in our welfare. This is quite symptomatic, or quite reminiscent rather, not symptomatic. It's quite reminiscent in many respects of u-Biko's work himself, and how u-Biko always approaches the question of racial discrimination in South Africa as necessarily racial discrimination as it is enacted by whiteness in the country. And for this reason then, colleagues, that I am going to focus quite particularly in this lecture on the question of language, and what it is that language can facilitate, and how it is that language and certain moves linguistically in terms of the prizing of English facilitates the erasure of a corpus of work, which of course centers again this question that I want to address here today, which is the question of intellectual integrity, both on the part of the South African Academy, but more importantly, I think as well on the part of Biko. Why would I do this? Colleagues might inquire. I'm doing this because I would like to begin to stitch together our intellectual histories so as to showcase what we are able to contribute in terms of what I conceptualize as the Black Archive. And this is interesting for me, or this is important rather for me, because I wish to destabilize a notion that is rooted in very racist modes of thinking in the country and forms of knowledge production, which is to say that Biko is the father of Black liberation thought in the country, which is not in many respects. As I say, it's a contentious topic, which is to suggest that he in fact draws most of what he draws from the texts of the likes of u-Goba, because in many respects, I am certain he was reading these texts, because it is quite a famous text, by the way, in isiXhosa. So then to begin with, to dive into it, it's to suggest that South Africa is defined by colonialism and continuing coloniality, a principal fact of which was the exclusion of Blackness and indigeneity from institutions of knowledge production. And this, of course, we see as well in terms of our understanding, or rather the framing of the participation of u-Goba's own critique in many respects against a series of the ways in which colonial governments functioned. And again, if colleagues will recall that at the beginning of this particular talk, I suggested that there is this contention that suggests that there was a redaction of the poem in its rendition by uGqoba in 1906. And that redaction necessarily comes from the fact that in the Lovedale Press itself, where isiXhosa was situated, there was that discomfort in the thinking and the writing of William Wellington Gqoba, which is to say that the colonialists were not too happy with the kinds of questions that u-Goba was posing and the kinds of discussions that he was inciting. So the exclusion here from formal institutions of knowledge production doesn't necessarily only delimit itself to the university space per se, but is far more open and is also inclusive, I would suggest, of spaces such as the press, specifically in the 19th century, which played a crucial part in terms of education, not only the education of the colonial settler in South Africa, but also the education and conversion of Blackness and indigeneity. This denial and erasure were given life through legislation such as the Witchcraft Suppression Act of 1957, by the way. And this particular piece of legislation is not only inaugurated in 1957, but gets, gets redrafted in 1957, but dates back to 1895. So these are debates, as I say, in the South African context that are not new. This is a very, very historical debate. As a pretext then to my main objective in this contribution, I aim to demonstrate how this particular piece of legislation, as well as these modes of exclusion, explicitly highlight how whiteness imagined Blackness and indigeneity, as well as Black indigenous thought rather, to function, an imagination that continues to haunt and define perceptions of Blackness and indigeneity in the country to this very day. And this is to say that in many respects, this particular imagination also goes to suggest that our languages, which are isiXhosa, isiZulu, Sesotho, Setswana, Sepedi, have no intellectual contribution to make, which is one of the reasons why, when we are thinking about Black liberation thought in South Africa, we begin with we begin with the work of Steve Biko, which is actually very, very late in many instances. And what I'm seeking to suggest for those in the room who understand any of the Nguni languages is to also showcase that u-Biko akakhulanga etsheni. This is to say that Biko did not arise out of a stone. He comes from a particular intellectual history, which is why I want to trace that intellectual history in order to better appreciate his contribution to the project of Black liberation thought in South Africa in the 20th century. So this historical ghost, birthed by the delusional and violent imaginations of whiteness, manifests contemporarily as the expression and the desire to intellectualize African languages. And of course, I find this notion of intellectualization quite and fundamentally flawed in many respects. And in many respects, I find it contentious, and we've seen it in the African sociolinguistic spaces where colleagues are talking about the fact that we need to intellectualize. And while I appreciate this particular notion, which of course comes from Russell Kashula's work, Russell Kashula is a sociolinguist who was at the time based at Rhodes University and is now in the University of the Western Cape. I must humbly protest the notion of intellectualization, as it seems to me, at least, to be playing into the notion that African languages were not intellectual prior to colonial incursion. In crude form, and I would like to think that this is not what is being suggested by the scholarship that is devoted to this area of research. The notion of intellectualization seems to reproduce and maintain colonial narratives about African languages and thought. This suggests that the notion of intellectualization plays into the ideas of African thought as in need of capacitation, while eliding the role of colonialism and coloniality in undermining the thought of Blackness and indigeneity since colonial incursion. In this instance, we see a double duplicity, I would suggest, manifesting firstly as colonial descendants framing themselves as coming to the aid or rescue of the debauched African's knowledge system. In the second move, the seemingly altruistic act of coming to intervene on the ruined systems of thought of the African is done without surfacing how it is that African thought came to be what it is, in the sense that whiteness here conceals the role it played in the devaluation process of African thought. In my reading, this is a truly concerning situation, but is not only epistemically arrogant, but dangerous, as it continues to frame whiteness as the savior of African thought. This is a reality that seems to define this area of scholarship, as the desire to intellectualize African languages is not only expressed by Russell Kashula. Kashula himself continues in the line of thinking detailed by Neville Alexander, for instance, when Alexander puts the question, at the outset it is essential, and I'm quoting here from Alexandra, at the outset it is essential to raise the crucial question that is only now beginning to be discussed openly in South Africa: why bother to develop African languages as a medium of instruction or languages of tuition at tertiary educational institutions, given that we have English and decreasingly Afrikaans as perfectly usable formal academic languages? In my understanding, then, the work done by Kashula seeks to legitimate this historical question as posed by Alexander, which begs the question of justice. Alexander's question, while useful in highlighting the epistemic injustices suffered by African people and their knowledge systems, seems to elegantly remove the complicity of whiteness in said injustices as detailed above. Kashula subsequently, sorry, colleagues, I've just lost my place here for a second. Kashula subsequently defines intellectualization in a way that I find lacking by suggesting that it is a twofold process. And I quote, firstly, the academic is required to access the world of the oral and written literature and to have a clear grasp of its practitioners and the content of their material. Secondly, the academic needs to engage with this material in order to place it on a national and international platform, thereby further intellectualizing the material for public consumption, critique, and growing intellectual debate in the field, contributing to the growth and recognition of isiXhosa, close quote. My critique of this definition is predicated on the inherent contradiction in the first move. Kashula suggests that the academic needs to engage this written material and develop the necessary lexicography in order to grasp the content of both the written and oral literature, written literature as well as oral literature. Herein lies the contradiction. If the work were not intellectual in the first instance, I suggest that the academic would in the first instance be without a corpus to engage. In the presence of a collection of written and oral texts such as music, I want to stake the claim that these languages were already intellectual. I would therefore press Kashula along with Alexander to rather devise another term that does not reproduce notions of white saviorism with respect to African thought. And this is what I wish to really, in many respects, resist even in the submission that I'm putting here today, colleagues, is to say that what we are seeing here by styling Biko as the father of Black liberation thought, because he has written in English, we erase an entire corpus of knowledge from which himself, Biko, is rooted as and is drawing from in terms of developing his own work. Put differently then, I draw the reader's attention to the selected piece of legislation, right, to demonstrate here, this is now the Witchcraft Suppression Act, to demonstrate what Pamela Maseko in conversation with Peter Vale calls the power of language. I will engage the effect of this legislation momentarily, but I begin by detailing the conceptual schema along with the conditions that have taken root, that have taken root in systems of knowledge production as a result of this legislation. Simply, we need to understand what reality this legislation has created. This is to say that while we might consider this legislation, the Witchcraft Suppression Act, to have been repealed from our governing legal frameworks in the country, languages of power continue through the ideologies instituted and inherited from this legislation to define the bastardization of indigenous Black ontologies and their subsequent epistemologies. This bastardization can be seen as the continuing delegitimation of African traditions of thought, a bastardization that demands that African thought, traditional or contemporary, fit neatly into colonial constructions. And this fitting neatly into colonial constructions, of course, colleagues, comes up again as this particular sort of project of wanting to assess Black thought when it is written in the English script. In simple terms, if the archive, this is now the Black archive of indigenous Black thought, does not fit the prescriptions of colonially contrived conceptions of history, then it is not an archive. This is what we are told, of course, right? And I find this to be seriously problematic. It might be useful to note that Kashula recognizes the objection that can be put to this argument that demands that African modes of thought should conform to colonial strictures. He anticipates this objection in the following ways, and I quote, "The material in I.W. Waitupe's isiXhosa Makalo, the implication of proverbs, contains detailed cultural comments on proverbs of recognizable antiquity designed to demonstrate that the isiXhosa speaking peoples had a coherent ethical system before the arrival of white settlers, and as such contains the analysis of the proverbs and the earliest philosophical writings in isiXhosa." Okay, so this is just contemporary ways of thinking. We already begin to see the kinds of contributions that isiXhosa has made in very useful ways, both in terms of the systematic application, of the systematic analysis rather, of our thought, as well as the systematic application of Black or indigenous thought. This is to suggest that Kashula seems to be aware of the white saviorism attitudes that define the knowledge production economy in the country, and attempts to sidestep this problematic thinking through highlighting the scholarship that is developed by Blackness and indigeneity. This move by Kashula further substantiates my objection to the notion of the intellectualization of African languages, right? So this is to say that, again, I'm just substantiating the idea that the notion of intellectualization for me doesn't quite cut it. This move that attempts to fix Blackness and indigeneity into the predefinitions of coloniality suggests, in the least at two levels, the usefulness of detailing, analyzing what is denoted by the notion of languages of power. Analyzing the meaning of this concept will be useful insofar as it allows me to think through and anticipate some of the objections that might be leveled against my own argument. In the first sense, then, it is useful to describe how the concept of a language of power is substantiated by the power of language. To put it simply, the power of a language can be observed in how its users use said power. Observing and detailing the use of power facilitates an entry point into the political economy at work, revealing modes of oppression and injustice that require correcting, specifically if we are to obtain a truly post-colonial condition in the South African context. The use of power, specifically in colonial contexts, has often resulted in what has been termed linguicide by scholars such as Sabelo Ndlovukatsheni. And of course, Sabelo Ndlovukatsheni has applied himself in very useful ways here. In my own argument in contesting the claim of epistemicide, I suggest that these claims of linguicide in South Africa, while useful, might be misleading with respect to the phenomenon that we are confronted with. I am in concord here with my previous publication, whereby I write that I begin by considering how erasure and self-negation are exacerbated by the claim of successful epistemicide and linguicide here, made by decolonial theorists who have been writing in the South African context. I mean to suggest here that while I use the concept of linguicide, I appreciate the effects that this concept can have in further playing into the narratives of white saviorism detailed in EndNote 2. And of course, what I wish to suggest here, colleagues, as well, is the suggestion that in as much as I might sort of think through this notion of linguicide, it goes back to that objection that I had put around intellectualization, which is to say that in the intellection itself, in the process of intellection, we cannot say that the language requires intellectualization, which is to suggest that if we are suggesting or if we are arguing for linguicide, my own view seeks to put the notion that we are conceding a very huge ground in that particular move by saying that there has been a linguicide that has been perpetrated. I can read isiXhosa, I can read u-Goba as he was writing in the 18th century and understand him very, very easily. And so for me, that suggests that maybe the notion of linguicide is not as profound as we would like to think of it. In the African context, where colonial domination was the name of the game, with the effects of this game being felt as early as the 17th century, the power of language manifested as the demand that those who enter into colonial institutions, organize education, organize religion and economy, be conversant in the languages of those in power. And of course, u-Goba as well applies himself quite necessarily to this question of this particular requirement that we be conversant with these languages, either Greek, Latin, or English. And of course, as the time for it developed, it became Afrikaans, as we saw with the student uprisings in the 1970s, which of course Biko himself was responding to. But again, do we begin to appreciate how that particular move, in the sense of Biko responding to that to that violent imposition in many instances, is not a new phenomenon that's happening in the 20th century. This is a historical debate. This is a historical phenomenon that goes as far back, as I say, as the 17th century. There's another collection by the same colleagues, Pamela Maseko and Peter Mtuze, who trace actually African thought, so that African intellectual thought here in South Africa as far back as the 18th, late 17th, early 18th century, moving into the 19th century, as we see with the work of u-Goba. In more recent years, this demand, but often denoted the denigration of African languages, has been lamented by Neville Alexander as the loss of entire systems of thought. Detailing this loss, Alexander argues, and I quote, "Suffice it to say that it is fast becoming common sense that the death of any language is akin to the disappearance of a species, since with the former we lose an entire library of information about large segments of the earth and perspectives on the worlds we live in," close quote. In the violence of coloniality, or rather the violence of coloniality through its expression of its commitment to the power of its language, this was witnessed through the translation of the Bible, along with the demand that those educated in colonial institutions study Latin and Greek. And of course, u-Goba applies himself to this very question. The translation of the Bible came with a violent demand that that Black Indigenous people denounce their cultures and cosmologies and assume rather the religion of the colonial master, that is Christianity. This claim is witnessed in and substantiated by the writing by the warring factions between amaqaba and amakholwa, believers and non-believers, a contestation that culminates in my own observation, which is to say that impi is ascending. And of course, you see this entire debate, and it has formed quite a lot of what we've seen, both in terms of fictional literature, as well as how post-colonial and decolonial scholars have applied themselves in South Africa, the question of Christianity and the imposition of Christianity. u-Goba, again, that's the second epic poem, by the way, that he does, this particular question of Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo, so the great debate between the non-believer and the Christian believer, right? So this is, there are very, very glaring historicities here, which I think we overlook when we tend to prize some particular individuals as those who are the ones that are the forefathers of Black liberation thought in South Africa. The power of language, coupled with the support it received through colonial violence, in some instances, signaled the death of culture, as witnessed in the disappearance of cultures of the Khoi, Abatwa, and the San, as well as the Damara people in South Africa. And of course, here I see as well that Kathy is here. Kathy was the individual who actually sort of asked me to point this out in a previous publication of mine, and she suggested that in fact, actually, we see this notion of epistemicide in these particular groups, right? So the Khoi, Abatwa, the San, as well as the Damara people in South Africa, crudely. And of course, by the way, I must also admit that there are lingerings of these peoples, even in the ways in which contemporary or young South Africans are engaging these histories. So if one goes to that particular album that's just recently been released by Buhle Bezwe, you will notice that in the introduction to the album, she has a very beautiful libation process that Uyise does. And Uyise is reciting the family history through his Tagazel clan names, and talks to the notion of the Damara people and the influence that the Damara people had on the Xhosa people, by the way. So we begin to see such richness in the languages which are supposedly in need of intellectualization. My time is beginning to tell me that I need to conclude. So crudely then, colonialism did not wince at the disappearance of certain languages in colonial territories, an arrogance that has robbed humanity of entire libraries of information about the worlds we inhabit. This arrogance denotes the second point of intrigue for my analysis. If the reader agrees with my thinking so far, I mean to say that these two moves, the language of power, feeds off of and is substantiated by the power of language, creating a circular move, I would suggest, circular movement that emboldens and substantiates colonial violence and erasure. In simple terms, the power of language manifests as and substantiates the languages of power. This manifestation of power is seen today in the contemporary university in the country, as it can still be argued, through the claim of contemporary coloniality that power in the knowledge production domain still resides with the monolingual speakers who privilege the use of English colonial descendants in a context where English is a second, if not fourth language for the majority of the people in the country. I wish to remind the reader of my first objective at this point. The reader will recall that the first claim I stake addresses the question of the archive. With whiteness delegitimating blackness and indigeneity since the inception of colonial violence, the question of the epistemic resources available to the decolonial theoretician becomes sharply focused. Put differently, if blackness and indigeneity were excluded from knowledge production sites, what legitimate resources does the decolonialist have in the project of thinking through the existence of blackness and indigeneity when theorizing from a place rooted in Black indigenous thought? Considering this question allows me to, in more pointed manner, answer how it is, in many instances, that the prizing of Biko's work conceals, in many respects, the intellectual histories, and how looking at the work of William Wellington Gqoba can play the role of facilitating theorizing of a place that is firmly rooted in blackness and Black embodiment. In order to expand on and substantiate this claim, however, I must first detail how, in many respects, the legislation to which I refer, which was the Witchcraft Suppression Act of 1895, I have chosen to focus my attention on, has facilitated the deracination of blackness and Black thought in our context. As indicated, I will return to this consideration in the section that follows momentarily. In the main, I am still concerned in this particular section with the power of language and languages of power. And here, colleagues, I'm just about to sort of give my concluding kind of a thought, which is to then begin to bring this analysis in many respects into the university space to demonstrate how the democratization, the opening up of the space by sort of looking into our languages facilitates in many instances a rich space from which we can begin to think about a lot of the contemporary questions that we are pressed to answer. Describing the power of language in the lecture theatre space, Siseko contends that those who are monolingual in the teaching and learning enterprise, predominantly white academics, exercise their power by demanding to know what the Black indigenous students are saying in the classroom context in their mother tongue, right? So there's always that imposition to have to explain ourselves, and many of us who have gone through Model C education, who have sat through lectures in these historically white institutions that we now teach at, all know the violence of that particular notion, which is to say that we were not permitted to speak our languages. And when we did speak our languages, there was incredible kind of reaction that we got, an eviscerating reaction in many instances from these institutions, which was to remind us of our place, which was to remind us of the place of our languages as not having, in many instances, epistemic merit or epistemic worth within those spaces that were exclusively created for whiteness. This, of course, is predicated on the desire to control knowledge in the learning environment. This desire in the country's higher education sector has manifested as the disciplining effects when Blackness uses its mother tongue in the pedagogic space. These problematic disciplinary mechanisms that in effect are symptomatic of the lack or inadequacies of academics in these institutions have been documented by Kap and Bangeni, with institutional discourses electing to frame students as deficient when they do not showcase mastery of the dominant language, that is English, the language of power. In simple terms, higher education institutions tend to construct students' home identity and languages as a problem that has to be fixed through the provision of academic development courses, framing Black Indigenous students as deficient when they are unable to master the languages of power points to the power of language and how this power feeds off of the master narratives constructed around the languages of power. To demonstrate the impact of the lack of criticality exhibited by South African Academy, I draw the reader's attention to a poignant question posed by Angubwachi and Ibers when they inquire, are we insinuating that non-native speakers of English cannot communicate? Keeping with this line of argument, they further inquire, and I quote, are we therefore claiming that to be literate in South African universities is to be able to construct knowledge in English only? Close quote. To answer their question, I would say yes. This is what is suggested by institutional cultures across the higher education landscape in the country. This claim comes from the reality that African Indigenous languages are framed as being in need of intellectualization. And I trust that my reader will understand at this point why I take issue with this notion of intellectualization. Moreover, there has been sustained work on the part of whiteness to denigrate the languages of Blackness and indigeneity. This denigration is then concealed by whiteness when it acts as the benevolent master coming to the aid of Blackness and indigeneity. I call these moves white lies, denoting acts of colonial violence. Angubwachi and Ibers continue their inquiry by exposing the power differentials that define the knowledge domain in the country when they ask, why do academic literacy lecturers continue to expect African students to construct knowledge eloquently in English when their peers of different races are not expected to do the same in African languages? My response to this question is simple. This bias in favor of English is premised on the concept of the languages of power as detailed above. The reader here might ask, where does English derive this power from? This question gives rise to the consideration of the legislation that I mentioned above, the Witchcraft Suppression Act of 1957. And basically, just to sum up, colleagues, because as I said, this is a full thing, this is a full chapter, and I don't want to waste time in the sense of just giving a lecture without us having the opportunity to engage. It is useful here to see in many instances how the political economy as it is structured and predicated necessarily on colonialism and coloniality then feeds into the ways in which we structure knowledge and knowledge production in the university space, and specifically in the South African context, which has in many respects undermined for a very, very long while the uses and I think the importance of indigenous languages, which of course culminates in this prizing of Bantu Biko's, what is it, I write what I like, and his sort of space. And I think what I wish to stress here as a way of sort of concluding my thinking here, what I wish to stress is the danger that this has caused. Because you will find today young Black intellectuals in the South African context who do not themselves know the historical context in which u-Biko comes to make his contribution, right? So because they have been educated, supervised by individuals who are necessarily progressive, and of course here shows up the problem of white liberalism, specifically in the post-colony. So progressive intellectuals who will necessarily want to read radical thinking and radical thought, but will necessarily position u-Biko as the starting point. u-Biko is not the starting point. u-Biko is, in many instances, and I always say this jokingly, but it is quite serious, he is a grandchild in comparison to the likes and the thinking of u-Gqoba and Umkai, for that matter, individuals that have not yet engaged today. He is a grandchild when we begin to think about the historical analyses that come from those intellectuals, because even in that fictional tale, the lawsuit of the twins that comes out in 1914 through the Lovedale Press from Siseko Mkai, we see similar kinds of questions being treated in the sense of this kind of contestation, this incredible contestation between the existence of African intellectual ways of thinking and ways of organizing the world, and how that necessarily comes up against modernity and the imposition of modernity in many respects. And so what I wish to suggest here, or what my work seeks to suggest is the danger that comes from this elision of that history, because young Black intellectuals today begin tracing their own intellectual processes through Biko. Biko comes as a result of work that has been done by other intellectuals, work which, by the way, I am certain he was reading. If one, as I say, again, does a comparative analysis, which work that he was reading, and of course, then he himself begins to mount this critique once again, but mounts it in English. And of course, then gets this incredible traction. So let me stop there for now and maybe tease out some of these thoughts through the question and answer session, so as to allow us maybe some opportunity for elucidation on some of this stuff. Sharon, thanks very much.